Hey guys, how you doing? Alrighty, Module 10B. All right, so after messing with your head a little bit with Module 10A, um, just again to get your head a little bit into that space, just for context, where we are now is 1950s, and especially in this lecture, we'll get to the 1960s. So post World War II, and again in a period where many people were struggling with any sense of faith. They were starting to question religions, and especially, by the way, this is the European context that we're talking about, European and American context to some extent. Um, and we saw more people kind of putting religion aside, but that left them with a real dilemma, which is, once you give up your faith and your sense of, eternal life and a doctrine of rules to follow, you basically lose both of those things. So you lose the sense of eternal life, which leaves you with your current existence. That's what you have. And it also means you lose the sort of doctrine that says this is good and this is bad. And people started to think, well, what is good and what is bad? Even to the point of some people challenging whether there is such a thing as good or bad in any real sense. Maybe these are also social constructions that we create. So it's a world that was, sort of struggling with these what are called existential problems. And we have this term of going through an existential crisis, which is the notion of somebody, in that situation. So, okay, let's go to here now, Module 10B. And by the way, I put the robot here because in some sense, the existential notion is that we are just complex biological machines. We can almost go back to Descartes and say, well, Descartes said animals don't have a soul, but humans do. Well, maybe they don't either. So this is sort of the existential camp, right? There isn't anything special. There isn't anything spiritual. There isn't anything eternal about us. We are also biological machines. Yes, we have a very complex behavioral repertoire, but ultimately we are machines, and we will die and be dismantled, and there will be no soul to leave our body because there's no place for a soul to go. All right, so imagine this sort of notion was becoming common, and you can imagine that a lot of people are struggling with it. So the people we're going to talk about today, Rollo May and Abraham Maslow, were more in these sort of late 50s, 60s. And this was sort of what was going on. And also, by the way, keep in mind what was going on, especially in America, but also throughout Europe, and to some extent throughout the world, was that sort of hippie revolution, right? The young people of the day are kind of who we're talking about here. Their parents were religious. Their parents were very conservative, and they approached life in very conservative, kind of rule-bound ways. But suddenly the children were, they had their own music. They were embracing freedom, which is an existential concept, right? And that's really the era we're talking about. And we're going to see that sort of hippie connection come through this piece a few times. So let's jump right into it. Let's start with Rollo May. And many people think of Rollo May as the one that, previously when we were talking about existentialism, those were really philosophers. And Rollo May is now going to bring some of that existential philosophy into psychology to some extent. So he published two books that were very sort of well known and well received. The first one is The Meaning of Anxiety. So he said, anxiety is the human being's basic response to a danger to his existence. So, that's what makes you anxious, are things that you feel are endangering your ability to exist or the quality of your existence in some way. If something threatens to negatively impact your existence, and that doesn't just mean end it, that means just make it really bad, for example, you feel anxiety. And that's what anxiety is. So he's tying this psychological feeling of anxiety, to this existential notion that's out there already. And he kind of talked about three different kinds of anxiety: pathological anxiety, neurotic anxiety, and normal anxiety. Pathological anxiety, he thought that's more the clinical psychology world. That's the kind of thing that, say Freud was interested in. but he thought just, neurotic and normal anxiety were part of all of our lives. And then in fact, in the existential phase, that anxiety was rampant. Heck, if it was rampant then, is it rampant now in COVID? You would think so. COVID is a threat to our existence, our way of life, and we are all feeling anxious. So let's just read a little bit about what he said here, just to get a feel for May. So he said, normal anxiety results in bewilderment, this confusion as to who we are and what we should do. Modern people are confused and bewildered because the traditional values do not work any longer. Again, let's keep in mind, he's talking about, the youth of the 60s and 70s that can no longer live the way their parents did. Those traditional values don't seem to work for them. Rugged individualism, which is like everybody for themselves, was fine for the 19th century, but it leads to isolation and loneliness in the modern city. So now that people are together in cities, if everyone just lives as an individual, then you have isolation and loneliness. Okay, and so that's one of the things he thought was kind of going on here. And this other one is kind of interesting too. The glorification of reason, which made sense in the early days of science, has led to a ruinous split between the intellect and the other parts of the person, such as the emotions and the will. He's going to make a big deal out of emotions and will in his next book. But let's just sort of split this a little bit. What he's saying is people started really to value rational thought. And things like experiments and data and all that kind of stuff. But he thinks they overvalued it to the extent that only rational responses to the world were sort of considered valid. When he thought, our emotions are a huge part of what makes us human. And we're being kind of cut off from that. We're being told we should be rational all the time. There's a song I have to mention right now called The Logical Song by Supertramp. Go look at it. Go check it out. But it's a song about a young child who enjoys life and is having all this great experience interacting with nature, which should bring you back to some of the ideas we talked about children and bonding with nature. But then there's a lyric that says, but then one day they sent me away to teach me how to be logical, rational, etc. And his life was ruined at that point in this song. It's like everything he was enjoying in his life suddenly was considered irrelevant and not worthy, and it was the being logical and rational that mattered. That's the feel of Rollo May here very much. So let's get to this last quote here, which is critical. The upshot is that the values and goals which provided a unifying center for previous centuries, and this could be religion, for example, in the modern period are no longer cogent. The task of the modern person is to rediscover a sense of self based on an exploration of one's existence. Okay, so if you put away the religious books and the beliefs that go with them, then what you're left with is your existence and your attempt to kind of figure out who you are and what your life is about. And so this is going to be, as we move into the psychology in this existential phase, and you're going to see that is really, what the focus is now on, is helping humans sort of become comfortable with themselves and who they are, and helping them kind of figure out what defines meaning in their life and how they can reach it. We're going to see that especially in Roger's work, which will be in the next lecture. But we're seeing the foundation of those ideas here in Rollo's thoughts. Okay, so now let's just quickly move on to Rollo's second book called Love and Will. It kind of echoes some of what we just said. So he said, when it comes to finding meaning, love and will are critical, especially in this world preoccupied with the intellect. So he thought, again, we're spending too much time on rational thought. So one thing we have to appreciate is love. And he saw this. So he was a little older than some of these younger people in the 60s. But what he saw in them, in these hippies, was a valuing of love and honesty and authenticity, people trying to be who they were, not trying to put on any false whatever. But he also saw problems with them. Of course, one of the famous phrases of the 60s was free love. And the idea was that people would just freely move from one partner to another, both sexually and emotionally. And it was wrong to expect commitment from a partner. Again, freedom, right? Existentialism, it's all about freedom. So you can't bound somebody else's freedom. And therefore you can have, fantastic time. You can feel like a really great couple, but if that person feels a little attracted to somebody else and they would like to go and hang around with them for a while, you're supposed to just be cool with it. That's not very human, by the way. It clearly was not a kind of system that could sustain very long, but for a while it was there, and we had the free love. But Rollo May didn't think that was sufficient. Love alone is important. He said it allows one to move away from apathy. So let's think of this for a little while. He said, there's this world outside and there's us, and we have to find a way to figure out our existence in that world and its meaning. Apathy is kind of a denying of the world, not caring about anything that's going on, and just distancing yourself from the world. And he thought that's no good. You have to come close to the world. And he thought that's what love allowed you to do. You get away from apathy, and you go seeking for this honesty and this openness and this freedom, and those sorts of things. But he thought you couldn't just have love. You also need will. And will was that notion again of making considered decisions, of being the person at the helm of your life, and making choices, not necessarily just guided by the intellect, of course. These could be emotion-based choices in Rollo's world. But if you just, had this willy-nilly love where you went any direction, whatever, and you didn't, for example, choose to commit to somebody, maybe at some point you might choose to do that, whether they choose to do it to you, maybe you wouldn't dictate that, but maybe you could say, I'm going to do this. And when you combine love with will, he thought that becomes caring. That becomes actually, investing yourself in your relationship with the world, so to speak. And that's what he thought you needed to do. You had to embrace the world. You had to understand that you are creating your own existence, and you had to decide to kind of do that. And that's what will is. Will is this empowering sense that I am going to take control of my own existence and I'm going to steer the ship, so to speak. And he thought that was key to personal growth. So again, let's just give you some of his words and his way of saying it. We love and will the world as an immediate, spontaneous totality. We will the world, create it by our decision, our fiat, our choice, and we love it. We give it affect, energy, power to love and change us as we mold and change it. This is the relationship you have with the world, okay? This is what it means to be fully related to one's world. I do not imply that the world does not exist before we love it or will it, but it has no reality, no relation to me, as I have no effect upon it. I move as in a dream. One can choose to shut it out, or one can choose to see it and create it. Shutting it out is apathy. Apathy. Somehow I got almost empathy there. Apathy is to shut out the world, but love is to choose to see it, and will is to choose to create it. And so it's a very empowering sense that, for you, the world is your existence. That's where you and the world come together, is your existence. And he's saying you have the power to shape that existence. The therapies we're going to see is going to be trying to help people do just that. Okay. All right. So that's Rollo May. For me, almost the natural thing would have been Rollo May to Rogers, but we're going to go Rollo May to Maslow. I'm going to follow the order of the textbook. The reason I say Rogers is because Rollo May is almost at a therapy, right? Helping people get there. But we're going to do a little bit of a detour. But again, I think, you're getting this existential humanist thing. This is about the human and the human's experience in the world. Okay, so let's jump to Maslow then and get the sense. And of course, Maslow is famous for his hierarchy of needs. Plus, he's a very happy, friendly-looking guy, which is always good. When in doubt, smile. Everybody likes a smiler. It's a good way to go through life. And by the way, if you smile, you're more likely to make yourself happy. Everybody who did Paul Ekman knows all about that. We're not talking about Paul Ekman, are we? We should be. He's cool. Did we talk about him? Maybe we will talk about him still. Okay. What is this hierarchy of needs? It's really, it's a theory, not necessarily of development, but a theory more about what it is you're striving for at any given time. What is important to you? What is on your mind? What are your goals kind of aligned with? And what he claimed is that there were these stages, these steps. It's often portrayed as a sort of pyramid here. And it's portrayed as a pyramid because in a pyramid, each higher level depends on the existence of the lower. The lower supports the higher level, right? And so that's the same idea with Maslow. He thought, people who are up here, whose focus is up here, we'll talk about what up here is in a second, but you would only be up here if things were pretty good down below you. If there's a problem here, you're going to be pulled down here. If there's a problem here, you're going to be pulled down here. So in order to get up there, you kind of have to have the lower levels in good shape. And so, if we think about this, let's start at the lowest level. So imagine COVID right now. I can make this really real. This was one of my great fears, by the way. During the toilet paper panic time, do you remember the toilet paper panic time? There was also a little bit of a buzz about a potential food shortage. That maybe because of COVID and because of the difficulty of creating food and delivering food and all that with all of these restrictions, that we might actually not have enough food. So imagine pre-COVID. I will suggest that most of us will get there, but I'll suggest that most of us were up here somewhere. You guys probably here, love and belonging, me a little bit more up here, esteem. But suddenly, if there was no food, suddenly if we were all hungry, we would go down here. So what does that mean, go down here? That means suddenly we would start thinking a lot about food. Where can we get the food? There's a rumor that this grocery store just got a delivery and we might go running over there to get it. And if there wasn't any food, we might think about it a lot. Oh man, I wish there was some food. Where could I find some food? So if you don't have air, air even more, right? Imagine someone prevents you from getting air. What is going to be on your mind? Getting air, right? You're going to fight, you're going to do whatever you can to try to take a breath. Similarly, water. If you haven't had water for a long time, you're going to get very thirsty, and that's all you'll worry about. And that goes for any of these physiological needs: food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction. Reproduction, I don't know about reproduction there. But he calls it a physiological need. Sure, let's give him that. But we don't need to reproduce. We do on a species level, but on an individual human level, which is what humanism is usually about, we don't need to reproduce. Nor do we need clothing. We need warmth. We need our body to be at a certain temperature. So, clothing in the sense that it does that. But otherwise, yeah. So anyway, just a little editorial comment from me there. But here's the idea. Once you have your physiological needs met, if you have all of these things in abundance and you're not worried about having them in the future, then you stop thinking about this. And what do you think about then? Well, he said the next level, when this is all fine, your next level is your safety needs. That once you have the biological needs met, then what you want is security. And that can be things like employment and access to resources. If you have health issues, that can be, focused on those health issues, etc. Property, what he means here is, if you own land or you own a house, you feel safer. It's not like you're going to end up on the street, suddenly, which is a danger, a risk. And so this is the sort of level where people, and we're going to see a lot of people here, by the way, in a post-COVID world, as the economy takes a hit and jobs are lost. Suddenly people are going to be worried about their personal security. Will they have a roof over their head? Can they get a job to bring in money to support their family? That all belongs here. And if you worry about that stuff, if you don't have those safety needs met, that's where your head is. Okay, you're getting the idea. So let's go up a little quicker now. Biological needs met, you feel safe and secure. Well, let me jump down here a bit because we might as well be relevant at times. The Black Lives Matter and those sorts of things. One way of talking about that is what we hear from a lot of black individuals, especially in America, but also in Canada, is this idea that they feel like they could be killed by a cop. And anytime they have police around them, but even when they potentially don't, they are thinking about their safety. When they see these stories continually about a police force killing or injuring black people in general, that makes them feel insecure. And what they're sometimes saying is it's really hard to live a good life. This is the good life up here. It's really hard to live a good life when you're continually worried about your personal safety. Seeing those videos makes people think that could happen to me, and it gets them a little bit more down here. So let's just attach that for a moment, get you thinking about that, okay? Because sometimes people have trouble understanding each other because they're at different points on this hierarchy. And it's really important to understand somebody else's concept or understand somebody else's situation and their perspective. That's usually the first step to having a decent conversation with somebody. So, just throw that out there. Okay, biological needs met, safety needs met. Next is love and belonging. This is where I would assume most of you guys probably certainly were before COVID. COVID may have pushed you down here somewhere. But if these things are met, then what do you want? You want a social network. You want friends. You want lovers. You want family. You want to feel like people care about you, and you want to care about other people. That becomes the sort of next level of your needs. And so a lot of university students, for example, that's sort of what they're looking for. That's the stage they're often at, is trying to form their networks of friends, maybe find their life partners, etc. And they're looking to establish that social network of loving and belonging. This is, by the way, why I say in some of my news things that when it comes to COVID and social distancing, us old people, we're up here somewhere, we established our social networks long ago, and they're just kind of around now, and we're not out there trying to create new social networks, trying to do whatever. And so when suddenly you can't interact with other people, it doesn't affect us that much. We already have our social networks. But to somebody who's at this stage, this is where their mind is. This is where their preoccupation is. Meeting new people, going out, being social, getting connections, and to suddenly deny them the primary ways of doing that is harder on them than it is on us older folks. And so when we see a bunch of young people getting together somewhere, this is what you're seeing. You're seeing a bunch of young people that are here. And that really feel the need to be with other young people and interacting and making friendships. And then you're seeing the older people look at them and saying, bad young people, you should behave better. I don't think there's enough acknowledgement of that sometimes. Okay, let's say you have your biological needs met, you have safety fine, you've established your social network. So typically we're imagining now more like a 30-year-old kind of person. Doesn't have to be, as you'll see in a moment, but somebody who kind of has their life partner, they have a family, they have their friends, and then the claim is then they start focusing on their esteem needs. And those esteem needs are we want people to respect us. We want them to recognize the effort we're putting into things. And so this is where, let's say in a job situation, we might really want those positive evaluations, maybe explicit positive evaluations every year, but just feeling like those people around us think we're pulling our weight, think we're bringing value, and they respect what we're doing, that we want to get that. And this is what actually will make us work hard, and try to establish a good reputation in a career kind of sense, because we're focused on these esteem needs, and that's what we're thinking about. Okay, and then the final highest level, and the claim is that only a few people ever reach this level. Most people top out somewhere around here, but every now and then somebody finds their purpose in life. They let's just be clear. Let's say a Martin Luther King. At some point in time, Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King, realized that a lot of the black community was looking to him to lead them to some extent, to motivate them, to organize them. And he realized he had skills in that regard, that he could give a good speech. That part is obvious. But then, through his words, he could not only shape the way that black people were thinking about their situation, but also the way that white people were thinking about the situation that black people were in. And so he learned that he was an activist, he was an organizer, he was a powerful voice of a bunch of people. And some people don't embrace that. If you look at any Bob Dylan documentaries, where they'll tell Dylan, you are the voice of your generation, and he'll say, I never wanted to be the voice of my generation. That wasn't what I was trying to do ever. I was just singing songs. Well, Martin Luther King is the voice of his people, and he embraced it, and he lived it, and you would get the sense that, I don't know if Martin Luther King got any money for anything he did. He may have. Did he get money for speaking engagements? I don't know. The claim is the self-actualized person often doesn't care. They are doing what they are doing because to them this is their purpose in life. They've found it. That's who they are. That's what they're about. Think of Gandhi. Gandhi would be this idea of peaceful resistance, non-aggressive resistance, right? He kind of came up with that concept, and then he lived that concept, and then he became that concept. His purpose became to show people how you could resist without being aggressive in response. So, etc. So, hey, let's now step back a little bit. So here's this framework. Where's it come from? This is a little bit like William James, right? Maslow just kind of came up with this. This wasn't the result of a bunch of data. It was him just kind of observing and thinking things through. And he comes up with this. And the thing is, it really has we sometimes say the smell test, right? If somebody suggests something to us and we think about it, we think, wow, that kind of sounds right. This is also the Freud kind of situation, right? Freud came out with this crazy ideas, but people started to think, maybe that's right, I think Freud was more exotic and weird, whereas Maslow is more, when people see this, they just go, yeah, that explains a lot. It's not very scientific, to be honest, and one of the things you're going to hear about humanism is that the scientific community didn't like it because it wasn't very data focused. It's not about experiments. But what often did happen is the community at large liked it, resonated to the ideas, and so they became very strong in business contexts and in other contexts like that. When I speak to reporters, there's almost no story that I can't relate to Maslow's hierarchy if I need to. It really explains or provides a conception to understand a lot of human behavior. But one could argue that, like Freud, without data supporting it, should you believe it? Should you believe it just because it feels right? Maslow definitely feels right. So did William James, and a lot of experiments showed that he was right. So you get the idea here. One last thing to say about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just to contrast it with some of the other things. It sounds sort of like a developmental set of stages, kind of like it might have you thinking Piaget, and of course Freud also kind of talked about people going through stages. Maslow didn't think of it really that way though, and he thought of it more like this, kind of a complex graph. But yeah, initially you care about your physiological needs. But as they are met, you care less about those, and you start caring now about safety needs. And as they get hit, you're caring a little bit about your love needs. So it's not like strictly you're at this stage, or this stage. You may be a little bit at a number of stages. So you may be mostly focused on your sort of needs for love, for example, but still sometimes you spend a bit of time thinking about your safety needs because they're not really nailed down totally, and maybe even sometimes you're thinking about your biological needs because they are also mostly okay. But if they're just mostly okay, part of your mind may be still watching there. And not only that, but you can regress. Okay, and so let me give you two examples of sort of that. And one is terrorism. What is the idea of terrorism? some country, the typical notion is some country, typically the US, has done a bunch of nasty things to my country, like dropping bombs or something like that, and killing people and causing unrest and whatever. And so we're going to respond by making the citizens of that country feel the terror that we have felt. And so they're going to do random acts to civilian populations with the whole purpose of making them feel terror. What does that kind of mean? Now, what that kind of means is whatever level they're living their nice little lives at up here somewhere, we're going to pull them down to here. And we're going to suddenly make them worried about their safety. And if they start worrying about their safety, they're gonna not work as hard. Their sort of civilization is not going to be as rosy as it was, and that's the life we live in. When we want to give them a taste of that, and so that's sort of the terrorist mentality, is to bring people back to their safety needs. And if you start removing some of this stuff, that's where we go to. The other example would be COVID. And we've talked about it a little while, but our world is changing, and suddenly we feel more insecurity. We're not so sure that we are safe. We're not even necessarily sure that there won't be something like a food shortage, etc. And so part of the anxiety that we talk about, and that even Rollo is talking about with existence, is caused by us first being up here, but then being pushed down levels of rungs on Maslow's hierarchy. A threat to our existence was the words Rollo used. That's what we have here. Okay, so in Maslow, these things could overlap, and you can move back and forth amongst them a little bit more freely. And again, many people would never reach self-actualization. Self-actualization is really finding your purpose in life. And some people, struggle for that. So that, that will lead us to Rogers in our next chapter, the struggle. So let's zoom out of here for a second and just say, this is a complex chapter. We start with this existentialism that's kind of like, ugh, my goodness. And now we're talking about some of the ways that sort of existential way of thinking can be brought into psychology to better understand sort of where people are at and what they might be anxious about at a given time. And so what we're going to finish up with in the next one is, okay, well, how can we help then? If we had a sort of therapeutic mindset, what can we do that will help these people find purpose in life and enjoy the existence that they have? That will be the goal of some of the humanistic therapies, so-called client-centered therapies, and we're going to talk about those next. Silver lining, just before I leave, part of what I'll tell you next in the next one is that the lessons we learn from humanistic therapy are amazing lessons for how to be a good friend. And so if that's something you would like to know, make sure you pay attention to the next lecture.